With her grandmother's life hanging by a thread and a broken piano as her only hope, 14-year-old Ellie faces poverty, the lies of the past, and the scorn of those who doubt her in a journey that could change everything or destroy what little she has left. You won't believe the heart-wrenching ending of this story of resilience. Ellie never wanted to carry the weight of a world that seemed to collapse on her young shoulders. At just 14 years old, she lived in a small industrial town in the United States, where gray streets and the hum of machinery defined the days. Since the tragic loss of her parents in an accident no one in town dared mention without lowering their gaze, Ellie had become the backbone of her family. She cared for her grandmother, a woman who had once been full of life but was now bedridden by illness, and for her little sister Mary, just 7 years old, whose smile was the only glimmer of light in Ellie's cloudy days. Within the worn walls of their old house, Ellie found refuge in the family's piano. Music was her voice, the only place where she could scream without being heard. But the piano, like her dreams, was broken. Its worn-out keys and cracked wood were a cruel reflection of what her life had become, a shattered promise. Yet Ellie couldn't bring herself to abandon it. Sitting at the piano was like visiting a dear friend she couldn't let go of, even when everything seemed lost. Her days started early and ended late. Ellie juggled household chores, her studies at the local school, and caring for her grandmother. Neighbors watched her with a mix of pity and judgment. Some whispered that she should focus on just being a teenager, but Ellie knew she didn't have that luxury. Someone had to keep the household running, even if it meant sacrificing her own childhood. Mary was a curious child, always asking about the before. "Did Mom play this piano?" she would ask, her big eyes full of longing. Ellie would respond with a forced smile, trying to mask the emptiness she felt. The truth was that everything in the house reminded them of their parents. The piano, the dusty photos on the shelf, the scent of her grandmother's old blanket. Every corner was a constant reminder of a happiness that seemed to belong to another life. The nights were the hardest. When Mary finally fell asleep and the house went quiet, Ellie allowed herself to feel the weight of the day. It was in those silences that the ghosts of the past would visit her. Memories of laughter, of piano melodies, and of promises for a bright future were almost unbearable. But she held back her tears, just as she held back so much else, knowing there was no room for weakness in her reality. At school, Ellie was a shadow of herself. Teachers saw the potential in her eyes, but also the exhaustion she wore like a second skin. Her classmates, though kind, kept their distance. She wasn't like them. While they talked about parties and crushes, Ellie thought about bills, medicine, and the next meal. Deep down, she didn't even care. Her life was different, and accepting that seemed to be her only option. Still, there were fleeting moments when Ellie allowed herself to dream. She remembered her mother's stories about a music competition in the nearby city, where the best talents would gather. "One day you'll be there," her mother had said, her eyes sparkling with pride. But that dream felt as distant as the moon. Entering something like that required money, support, and a functional piano, things Ellie simply didn't have. The days dragged on with a cruel monotony until her grandmother's health began to deteriorate even further. It was as if the world around her was crumbling faster, and Ellie felt the ground slipping out from under her. The local pharmacy refused credit, and the meager earnings from her odd jobs weren't enough to buy the medicine her grandmother desperately needed. Despair grew with every visit to her grandmother's room, where her eyes seemed to plead silently for help. That same week, while cleaning out the attic, Ellie stumbled upon a stack of old letters. Among them, she found a photograph of her mother standing beside the piano, holding a trophy from the music competition. "She won," Ellie whispered to herself, her throat tightening. In that moment, an idea, bold and terrifying, began to take shape in her mind. Sitting on the cold attic floor, Ellie stared at the photo for several minutes. Her mother had one with the same piano that now sat broken and silent. Could she restore it? And if she managed to enter the competition and win the prize, would it be enough? But doubts came crashing down like an avalanche. Was she good enough? Was this even possible? The only thing Ellie knew for sure was that she had to try, before it was too late. Mornings in Ellie's house were becoming increasingly tense. The sound of her grandmother's worsening cough echoed through the walls, turning the atmosphere into a constant state of worry. Ellie counted the coins in an old jar, desperately trying to scrape together enough for the necessary medicine, but it was never enough. The helplessness burned inside her, and the weight of responsibility seemed to double with each passing day. One day, while flipping through a forgotten newspaper at the grocery store counter, Ellie stumbled upon an ad for a music competition in a nearby city. The prize was substantial, enough to cover her grandmother's treatments and even provide temporary stability for her family. But there was a glaring problem: her broken piano. It felt like a cruel joke that the solution to her problems relied on something so far out of reach. On the walk home, Ellie couldn't stop thinking about the ad. The idea felt absurd, even impossible, but it continued to hammer at her thoughts. What if there was a way? What if she could somehow fix the piano and enter the competition? Doubt and hope waged a silent battle in her mind as she walked through the gray streets of her small town. At home, Ellie found Mary sitting on the floor, drawing a picture of their broken piano. "Will you still play for me one day?" Mary asked, her eyes wide with expectation. In that moment, something shifted inside Ellie. This wasn't just about money or the competition anymore. It was about what the piano meant to Mary, to their grandmother, and to herself. She had to try. Over the following days, Ellie began asking discreet questions at school, searching for anyone who might know how to repair the piano. Most of the responses were dismissive, accompanied by snickers or pitying looks. "You're dreaming too big," some said. But those words only fueled her determination. If no one else believed in her, then she would believe in herself. Still, the doubts haunted her. Every night was a battle between the desire to fight and the fear of failing. Ellie often sat in front of the piano, her fingers hovering over its broken keys, playing imaginary notes and hearing the music only in her mind. As much as she longed to move forward, the thought of failing paralyzed her. Her grandmother depended on her, and there was no room for mistakes. The worst night came when her grandmother suffered a severe health crisis. Ellie sat by her bedside, holding her frail hand and listening to the words that escaped as barely a whisper. "You're strong, Ellie. Stronger than you know." Those words etched themselves into her memory, echoing as a reminder in her darkest moments. The next morning, Ellie made a decision. No matter how difficult it would be, she would try. Fix the piano, enter the competition, win the prize. It was a plan full of uncertainties, but it was all she had. The doubts still lingered, but for the first time in weeks, a spark of hope ignited within her. Ellie knew she couldn't do it alone, but where would she even begin? The piano was practically in pieces, and the little money she had was barely enough for her grandmother's medicine. The feeling of swimming against an unrelenting current was overwhelming, but Ellie clenched her fists and resolved to push forward. After all, she had no other choice. With each step toward her plan, Ellie felt as if she were venturing into uncharted territory. The idea of fixing the piano seemed ridiculous to everyone around her, but to Ellie, it was a chance, perhaps her last, to save her family. Deep down, she knew this journey would be filled with challenges, but one thing was certain: there was no turning back now. Doubts hit Ellie like a tidal wave, swift and overwhelming. Sitting in front of the piano, she stared at its broken keys and worn wood, feeling ridiculous for believing it could take her anywhere. How could she, a 14-year-old girl with no professional experience, possibly compete with trained musicians who had perfect instruments and unwavering support? Fear was a constant companion, whispering that she wasn't enough. At night, while Mary clung to the tattered teddy bear she had inherited from their mother, Ellie lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling and imagining all the ways things could go wrong. What if she humiliated herself on stage? What if her grandmother couldn't hold on long enough to receive the treatment? Each scenario seemed more terrifying than the last, making the dream feel almost unbearable to carry. At school, the whispers from her classmates only deepened her insecurity. "Ellie wants to fix her piano and win a contest," they said, snickering behind her back. Even without confronting her directly, their dismissive looks were enough to make her stomach churn. It felt like the entire world was conspiring to remind her that dreaming big was an unforgivable mistake for someone in her position. Returning home, the familiar sight of her frail grandmother in bed and Mary asking for help with homework nearly made Ellie abandon her plan altogether. She thought it might be better to focus on what she could control, like keeping the household afloat. Attempting something so ambitious seemed selfish, a distraction from her responsibilities. But the piano was always there, a silent reminder of what she deeply wanted. One particularly difficult night, after her grandmother had another health scare, Ellie broke down. Sitting at the kitchen table, tears streamed down her face as she clutched a photo of her mother holding the competition trophy. "I'm not her," she murmured, her voice cracking. The memory of her mother's love and strength only made Ellie feel smaller. How could she ever fill those shoes? It felt impossible. For days, Ellie avoided the piano, convincing herself that staying away from the dream would hurt less than watching it crumble. But the emptiness inside her only grew. The silent nights were suffocating, and the weight of unpaid bills and her grandmother's worsening health felt like an anchor dragging her down. A comment from a neighbor, a sharp-tongued woman who seemed incapable of kindness, was the breaking point that week. "You need to accept that some things aren't meant for people like us," she said bluntly. Ellie nodded weakly, but inside, she felt a storm brewing. The words stung, but a part of her wondered if the neighbor was right. Even as thoughts of giving up consumed her, something within Ellie refused to let her abandon the idea completely. It was like a tiny flame, flickering but persistent, that refused to be extinguished. Every time she looked at Mary, heard her grandmother's faint laughter, or ran her fingers over the piano keys, the desire to try surged back, stronger than before. Ellie found herself at an emotional crossroads, where each path seemed laden with risk. On one side was the safety of staying where she was, shielded from criticism and failure. On the other was a sea of uncertainty, but with the chance to achieve something greater. It wasn't just the piano that needed fixing, it was her belief in herself. One night, Mary approached Ellie with a hand-drawn note. "You're going to win," it read in clumsy, childish letters. It was a small gesture, but it warmed Ellie's heart in a way nothing else could. She still didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't let her sister and her grandmother down without at least trying. Fate has a strange way of guiding those who feel lost. On that cold morning, as Ellie pushed the old piano into the backyard, determined to at least figure out what needed to be done, a rough voice broke through her thoughts. "Sweetheart, that thing won't even play a lullaby anymore." It was Mr. Tanner, the elderly man who lived on the next street, known for fixing furniture and, apparently, pianos too. Tanner was a man with calloused hands and eyes that carried too many untold stories. When he saw Ellie's piano, he let out a long sigh, as if he understood exactly what the instrument meant to her. "It's not going to be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is, right?" he said as he began inspecting the damage. There was something in his tone that mixed challenge and encouragement, as if he was willing to help, but only if she was ready to fight for it. In the weeks that followed, Ellie spent more time in the backyard than inside the house. Tanner brought old tools, explaining each step of the work, and occasionally shared stories from his youth. He had lost his wife and son years ago, and fixing things had become his way of finding purpose again. "We fix what we can to survive what we can't," he said one day while sanding one of the piano's wooden panels. Tanner's lessons went far beyond the piano. He taught Ellie about resilience, patience, and the importance of believing in herself, even when the world seemed determined to prove otherwise. "The music isn't in the instrument, Ellie. It's in you. The piano is just the vehicle," he told her. Those words echoed in her mind during the silent nights, a reminder that what she was searching for wasn't just about repairing an object but rediscovering her own voice. One day, as Ellie adjusted one of the piano's keys, another unexpected figure entered her life. Sarah, a professional violinist who often performed at events in the city, appeared at the gate. She had heard about Ellie's efforts and came to offer her help. "If you believe in what you're doing, then it's worth it," Sarah said, handing her sheet music that could help with the competition. Sarah had a straightforward yet kind demeanor, and she quickly became an emotional mentor to Ellie. She spoke about the challenges of growing up as an artist without support and how learning to rise above criticism was essential. "The only person you need to prove anything to is yourself," she said in a tone that seemed to pierce through Ellie's insecurities. With Tanner and Sarah by her side, Ellie began to see possibilities where she had only seen obstacles before. Day by day, the piano came back to life, and with it, Ellie felt as though she was piecing together fragments of her own broken dreams. It was as if restoring the instrument was also helping her rebuild parts of herself she thought were lost. But the road was still uncertain. Tanner, despite his expertise, had physical limitations, and Ellie knew that time was against them. Sarah brought energy and guidance, but the competition loomed ever closer, and Ellie still doubted whether she would be ready. Even with all the support, the lingering ghost of self-doubt whispered that perhaps she was only fooling herself. One particularly challenging afternoon, Tanner cupped Ellie's chin with his trembling hands and said, "You already have everything you need. The courage to start is what separates dreamers from winners." His words, spoken with such conviction, ignited something inside her. It was no longer about what she might lose but about what she stood to gain. Ellie knew she had found unexpected allies, but she also understood that the biggest battle would still be her own. The piano was nearly ready, but the true test would come when the stage lights shone on her. And while the thought terrified her, she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could face whatever lay ahead. That morning, the sun seemed a little less shy, casting a soft light across the backyard where the piano now stood fully restored. Ellie ran her fingers over the keys, hesitating, as though she couldn't believe she had come this far. When she pressed the first note, the sound that echoed wasn't perfect, but it carried a certain magic. It was as if the instrument was returning to her the courage she thought she had lost. Tanner cleared his throat, visibly emotional, while Sarah stood beside him, smiling proudly. "It's your turn now, Ellie. The piano is ready, but are you?" Tanner said, with the calm wisdom of someone who had faced his own share of challenges. Ellie knew there was no more time to hesitate. The deadline to register for the competition was the next day, and the moment to take the next step had arrived. By early afternoon, Ellie's heart was racing faster than her feet as she arrived at the registration venue. The hall was intimidating, filled with impeccably dressed young musicians accompanied by attentive parents and strict coaches. In contrast, Ellie wore the only outfit she felt was decent enough, clutching a worn-out sheet of music Tanner had helped her choose. The stares from the other competitors were heavy, almost suffocating. Some whispered, others blatantly ignored her. Ellie tried to hold her head high, but the weight of expectations and fear nearly made her turn back. She didn't, because deep down she knew this wasn't just about her. Her grandmother and Mary depended on her courage. When Ellie handed in her form, the woman at the reception desk smiled. A small gesture, but one that offered her a thread of comfort. "Good luck, sweetheart," the woman said warmly. For the first time in days, Ellie felt something other than anxiety. No matter how difficult this seemed, she had taken the step she needed to take. She was officially registered. When Ellie returned home, the news was met with a mix of emotions. Mary jumped with joy, as if she already knew Ellie would win. Tanner and Sarah applauded her decision but were keenly aware that the hardest challenges were yet to come. The competition was in 2 weeks, and every minute would be critical in preparing her performance. Ellie divided her days between intense rehearsals and caring for her household. The restored piano became her refuge but also a constant reminder of the pressure she carried. The music came with difficulty, and every mistake felt like a reminder that failure lurked just around the corner. Yet she persevered, playing until her fingers ached. One particularly tough evening, Sarah showed up with an unexpected suggestion: to perform together. "I'll accompany you with the violin. We can create something unique, something that shows who you are." Ellie hesitated, but Sarah's enthusiasm was infectious. For a moment, the weight on Ellie's shoulders seemed lighter, and the thought of creating something new reignited her passion for music. The rehearsals with Sarah brought a different kind of energy. Despite the hurdles, Ellie started to believe that her story wasn't about competing with others but about telling her own journey. Each note she played was a piece of the struggle, love, and hope that drove her forward. The music stopped being just a distant dream and became her purest form of expression. When the day of the competition finally arrived, Ellie looked at the piano and felt a mix of nerves and determination. Tanner and Sarah stood by her side, and Mary gave her a tight hug before leaving for the audience. "You're going to shine," Mary said, with the conviction Ellie was still trying to find in herself. The moment she had dreaded was here, and there was no turning back now. The morning of the competition arrived under gray skies, as though the weather itself understood the turbulence awaiting Ellie. She carefully loaded the piano onto the small truck Tanner had lent her, feeling every bump in the road as a threat to the instrument she had worked so hard to restore. Sarah followed behind in her car, ready to help, while Mary waved from the window at home, offering a shy smile of encouragement. Ellie took a deep breath, trying to suppress the growing anxiety in her chest. When she arrived at the theater, the scene was even more intimidating than she had imagined. The other competitors radiated confidence and elegance, while Ellie felt out of place in her simple dress and with the calluses visible on her hands. Some glanced at her with mild curiosity, while others ignored her altogether. But the disdain of one particular competitor was impossible to miss. A tall girl with an air of superiority muttered loud enough for Ellie to hear, "She won't last 5 minutes on stage." Despite the cruel words, Ellie found strength in Tanner's reassuring gaze as he adjusted the piano backstage. "Let them underestimate you. They have no idea what you're made of," he said with the calm of someone who had faced far greater challenges. His words echoed in Ellie's mind, helping her focus on what truly mattered: the music, the chance to change her life, and her family's future. Backstage, Sarah tuned her violin while Ellie silently rehearsed the performance in her head. The two of them had practiced tirelessly, but the pressure was immense. "Remember, Ellie, the audience doesn't want perfection, they want emotion. Play like you're telling your story," Sarah said with an encouraging smile. Ellie nodded, trying to absorb every word as the nerves threatened to overwhelm her. The hours dragged on as Ellie waited for her turn. The muffled sounds of the earlier performances reached her backstage, enough to fuel her doubts. The performances were flawless, and the audience responded with enthusiastic applause. The idea that her struggles might not be enough lingered in her mind like a persistent ghost. Sensing her unease, Tanner placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Trust in what you've built. You already won the moment you stepped onto this path." When her name was finally called, Ellie's heart nearly stopped. She walked onto the stage with hesitant steps, feeling the weight of the audience's and judges' eyes on her. The piano looked small under the bright lights, but for Ellie, it was the only thing that made her feel whole in that moment. Sarah stood beside her with her violin in hand and whispered, "Let's show them what we're made of." The performance began shakily. The first notes came out trembling, and Ellie felt the fear rise within her. But then, she closed her eyes and thought of Mary's face, her grandmother's tired smile, and the words of Tanner and Sarah. The music began to flow more naturally, each note carrying the weight and emotion of her journey. The melody became a living story, and the audience fell silent, captivated by the depth of her performance. When the final note faded into the theater, the silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Then the applause began, hesitant at first, but quickly swelling into a standing ovation. Ellie opened her eyes and saw the faces of the audience and judges, many of them visibly moved. Sarah smiled at her, and Tanner, watching from the wings, discreetly wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. Ellie knew that something inside her had changed forever. Despite the triumph of her performance, Ellie knew the competition wasn't officially won yet. The judges' decisions would come later, but in that moment, it didn't matter. She had faced her fears, the criticism, and the doubts, and that was a victory in itself. As she stepped off the stage, Tanner greeted her with a warm embrace. "You did it, Ellie. Now we wait," he said, his pride radiating like a light in the dim backstage. In the theater hallway, Ellie encountered the girl who had mocked her earlier. The air of superiority was gone, replaced by something resembling respect. "You were amazing," the girl said almost awkwardly. Ellie simply smiled, saying nothing. She knew that the real battles were fought within, and on that day, she had won the greatest one of all. The ride home was supposed to be a moment of relief, but life had other plans for Ellie. Tanner's old truck, which had been showing its age for years, rattled more than usual on the bumpy roads. With every jolt, Ellie felt her chest tighten, terrified for the piano that had demanded so much effort. And then, it happened. A larger-than-expected pothole sent the truck bouncing, and the impact was enough to deal irreparable damage to the instrument. When Tanner pulled the truck over to assess the damage, Ellie saw the piano's pieces scattered on the ground like fragments of her dreams. The sight was unbearable, and the tears came before she could stop them. "No, not now," she whispered, her voice breaking. Tanner tried to console her, but his words felt distant, as though nothing could soften the blow of that moment. Back home, the silence was oppressive. Sarah arrived not long after and found Ellie sitting on the living room floor, hugging her knees. The violinist didn't try to diminish her pain. Instead, she sat down beside her, sharing the silence. "This isn't the end, Ellie. It just feels like it right now," she said after a few minutes. But Ellie couldn't see past the shattered piano. Without it, the competition felt like an unreachable dream. In the days that followed, Ellie hardly mentioned the piano. Mary tried to cheer her up, crafting new posters to motivate her winning sister, but even those felt like cruel reminders of what she had lost. Her grandmother, frail but wise, tried to comfort her, holding Ellie's hand and saying, "You've overcome worse. You'll find a way." Yet even those words seemed to fade into the emptiness Ellie felt. It was Sarah who came up with a new, albeit risky, idea. "We could try using an electric keyboard," she suggested. "It won't be the same, but you still have your talent, Ellie. That's something no one can take from you." The idea was so far from what Ellie had envisioned that, at first, she rejected it. How could she impress the judges without her piano? It all felt like a desperate attempt rather than a real solution. Tanner wasn't ready to give up, either. He spent hours exploring ways to salvage at least part of the piano, but he knew time wasn't on their side. "If you're going to fight, Ellie, you need to fight with what you have," he said, as he tuned the strings of an old keyboard he'd borrowed from a friend. It was their only viable option, and Ellie knew it. Still, accepting the keyboard felt like accepting that her dreams wouldn't be as she had imagined. Ellie spent hours staring at the instrument, unable to bring herself to play it. It was smaller, colder, and each note seemed to lack the soul her piano had. Yet, with Sarah by her side, gently urging her to pour her heart into the music regardless of the instrument, Ellie slowly began to practice. The final night before the competition was the hardest. Ellie felt as though the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. The keyboard seemed inadequate, her hands shook, and the pressure of not letting her family down nearly drove her to quit. That was when Mary came into her room with a simple note, "You're the best pianist in the world. I believe in you." It was all Ellie needed to remember why she was doing this. On the morning of the competition, Ellie loaded the keyboard into the small truck, feeling less confident than she wanted to. Tanner hugged her before they left, saying, "Today, you're going to play more than music. You're going to play hearts. That's what matters." His words stayed with her as they drove to the event, helping her focus despite the fear still gnawing at her. Ellie knew she would face judgmental stares, and many would see the keyboard as a sign of weakness. But she also knew there was no turning back now. Her performance would be different, imperfect, but filled with truth. And deep down, she was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. When Ellie's name was called, her heart felt like it might leap out of her chest. Every step toward the stage was a challenge, a reminder of how hard she had fought to be there. The borrowed keyboard looked small and out of place under the bright lights, and the audience, accustomed to grand pianos and flawless performances, watched with quiet curiosity. Ellie took a deep breath, trying to hold on to Tanner's words, "You're going to play hearts?" It was all she had. The beginning was shaky. The first notes escaped her trembling hands, and for a moment, Ellie feared she might lose control. She could feel the weight of the judges' gazes and hear the faint murmurs of the audience. But then she closed her eyes. In her mind, she was back in the backyard at home, playing for Mary and her grandmother, the two people who gave her the strength to keep going. Slowly, the notes began to flow with clarity, each one imbued with raw emotion. The melody that Ellie and Sarah had crafted was unlike anything the audience had expected. It wasn't about perfect technique or musical complexity. It was a story, Ellie's story. A tale of a girl who had lost nearly everything but found strength in her love for her family. The music seemed to speak directly to the hearts of those listening, turning the stage into a space of vulnerability and honesty. Sarah's violin was the perfect complement to Ellie's performance. Every stroke of the bow seemed to respond to Ellie's notes, creating a harmony that filled the theater with something far greater than just music. Completely absorbed by the melody, Ellie forgot about the judges, the audience, and even the borrowed keyboard. In that moment, she was simply a girl trying to save her family with the only tools she had. When the final note echoed through the theater, the silence that followed was deafening. Ellie opened her eyes, bracing herself for the worst. Then, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound grew, spreading through the room until the entire theater was on its feet, erupting in applause. Tears rolled down Ellie's cheeks before she could even process what was happening. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about reaching those people, even if just for a moment. Backstage, Tanner was waiting for her with a proud smile. "You did the impossible," he said, pulling her into a tight hug. Sarah, equally emotional, held her hand and whispered, "They'll never forget what they heard today." Ellie felt a mix of relief and gratitude, though part of her still feared the final judgment from the judges. The moments that followed felt like an eternity. The judges deliberated and Ellie, still backstage, could hear only snippets of their conversation. She knew she didn't have the polished technique of the other competitors, but she believed she had left a mark in her own way. When the winners were finally announced, her heart stopped for a second. Ellie didn't take first place. The top prize went to a more experienced pianist whose performance had been flawless. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the judges picked up the microphone and made an announcement. Although Ellie didn't win the grand prize, her story and her music touched all of us in a way that transcends this competition. That's why we've decided to create a special honorary mention just for her. The audience erupted into applause again, and Ellie felt something even more valuable than victory: recognition. She had shown everyone, and herself, that she was capable of facing her fears and transforming her pain into something beautiful. When a local businessman approached her to offer financial support for her family and a music contract, Ellie realized the competition was only the beginning of something much greater. The journey home was different this time. Ellie didn't carry a shiny trophy, but she brought back something far more meaningful: the knowledge that her struggle hadn't been in vain. The look in Mary's eyes as she ran to hug Ellie was proof enough that, regardless of the results, Ellie was the true winner of this journey. The house felt different when Ellie returned. The air carried something new, a blend of relief and hope that hadn't been there before. Mary ran to hug her, her small smile lighting up the room. "I knew you'd do it," she exclaimed, as though Ellie had brought home the biggest trophy of all. But for Ellie, the most meaningful moment came when her grandmother, frail but determined, lifted a trembling hand to caress her face, her eyes shimmering with pride. With the financial support promised by the businessman, Ellie was finally able to take her grandmother to the hospital for the much-needed treatments. The first appointment was filled with emotion. "Now you can focus on your music, Ellie," her grandmother said, her tired smile radiating pride. It was as if the weight Ellie had carried on her shoulders for so long was starting to lift, piece by piece. Tanner and Sarah remained by Ellie's side, celebrating her victories and helping her plan her next steps. Tanner, reluctant to accept any gratitude, received a simple yet meaningful gift from Ellie, a plaque inscribed with the words, "Believing is the first step to transforming dreams into reality." He hung it in his workshop, where he continued to fix things, but now, with a smile that had long been missing. The contract offered by the businessman led Ellie to perform at small local events, where her story was shared alongside her music. Each performance was a chance to reconnect with her passion for music and to share her journey with others. Although she still felt nervous before stepping onto the stage, Ellie now carried something she hadn't had before: confidence in herself and the power of her emotions. Mary, always by her side, became Ellie's little promoter. "My sister is the best pianist in the world," she'd announce to anyone who would listen. Ellie laughed at her enthusiasm, but she knew those words held the same truth Mary saw in her music. It was for Mary, her grandmother, and her mother that Ellie continued to play. Every note she pressed was a tribute to the people she loved. Despite all the changes, Ellie never forgot the hardships she had endured. The restored piano, now back in the living room, stood as a symbol of resilience. The cracks in the wood were left untouched, not because they couldn't be repaired, but because Ellie believed they told a story. "This is how we grow," she told Tanner one day, as her fingers ran over the worn surface. As months passed, her grandmother's health improved, and Mary started attending music lessons, inspired by her sister. The house that had once felt heavy with sadness was now filled with laughter and melodies. Ellie knew there would still be challenges ahead, but she had discovered something powerful within herself: the ability to turn adversity into strength. During a performance at a larger event, Ellie received an anonymous letter. Inside was a single sentence: "Your music reminded me that life is full of twists and turns, but also beauty." In that moment, Ellie realized that her journey had touched not just her family but strangers who found hope in her story. That night back at home, Ellie sat at the piano and began to play. Mary lay on the floor beside her, listening intently to every note. The music was different now. It wasn't about proving anything to others or even to herself. It was simply about living, feeling, and moving forward. Ellie glanced at the photo of her mother resting atop the piano and smiled. "You were right, Mum. Music really is our soul." And with that, she struck the final note of the evening, a quiet reminder that, even in the hardest of times, there is always something worth saving. The house felt different when Ellie returned. The air carried something new, a blend of relief and hope that hadn't been there before. Mary ran to hug her, her bright smile lighting up the room. "I knew you'd do it," she exclaimed, as though Ellie had brought home the biggest trophy of all. But for Ellie, the most meaningful moment was seeing her grandmother's eyes sparkle with pride. Despite her frailty, she raised a trembling hand to touch Ellie's face gently, a silent gesture of love and admiration. With the financial support promised by the businessman, Ellie was finally able to take her grandmother to the hospital for the treatments she desperately needed. Their first visit was an emotional one. "Now you can focus on your music, Ellie," her grandmother said, her tired smile full of pride. It felt as though the heavy weight Ellie had been carrying for so long was slowly being lifted, one piece at a time. Tanner and Sarah stayed by Ellie's side, celebrating her accomplishments and helping her figure out the next steps. Tanner, who was never one to accept thanks easily, received a simple but heartfelt gift from Ellie. A small plaque that read, "Believing is the first step to turning dreams into reality." He hung it proudly in his workshop, where he continued fixing things, but now with a renewed sense of purpose and joy. The contract offered by the businessman opened up opportunities for Ellie to perform at small local events, where her music was accompanied by her story. Each performance became a chance for her to reconnect with her passion and share her journey with others. While she still felt nervous before each show, Ellie now carried something she hadn't before: faith in herself and in the emotions that shaped her music. Mary, always at Ellie's side, became her biggest cheerleader. "My sister is the best pianist in the world," she would tell anyone willing to listen. Ellie laughed at Mary's enthusiasm, but deep down, she knew those words held a truth that her little sister saw in every note she played. It was for Mary, for her grandmother, and for the memory of her mother that Ellie continued to pour her soul into her music. Despite all the changes, Ellie never forgot the struggles that had brought her here. The restored piano, now back in the living room, stood as a symbol of everything she had overcome. Its cracks and worn spots were left untouched, not because they couldn't be fixed, but because Ellie believed they told a story. "This is how we grow," she said to Tanner one day, running her fingers over the wood that bore witness to her journey. As months went by, her grandmother's health improved, and Mary began attending music lessons, inspired by her sister. The house, once filled with quiet sadness, now rang with laughter and melodies. Ellie knew that challenges would still come, but she also knew she had discovered something powerful: the strength to turn struggles into resilience and purpose. One evening, after performing at a larger event, Ellie received an anonymous letter. Inside, there was just one sentence: "Your music reminded me that life is full of twists and turns, but also beauty." Reading it, Ellie realized that her story had touched more lives than she ever imagined. Her journey wasn't just her own anymore. It was a source of hope for others too. That night back at home, Ellie sat down at the piano and began to play. Mary lay on the floor nearby, listening to every note with rapt attention. The music felt different now. It wasn't about proving anything, to others or to herself. It was about living, feeling, and moving forward with grace and strength. Ellie glanced at the photograph of her mother resting atop the piano and smiled softly. "You were right, Mum. Music truly is our soul." And with that, she played the final note of the night, a quiet, powerful reminder that even in life's hardest moments, there is always something worth saving. Ellie had changed. It wasn't something she could pinpoint exactly, but she felt it deep within herself. Before, each day had seemed like an endless battle against an uncertain future. Now, she saw life as a composition, filled with challenging notes but also unexpected harmonies. The competition hadn't made her a star, but it had uncovered a strength she never knew she had. And that strength was guiding her, note by note, along a path she was creating for herself. Her grandmother, who once struggled to speak, now insisted on sitting near the piano whenever Ellie played. "You're not just a pianist, Ellie. You're the melody that holds this family together," she said with a smile that carried the wisdom of a lifetime. Those words, spoken in a moment of peace, echoed in Ellie's heart like the perfect note at the end of a complex song. Tanner and Sarah had been pivotal in her transformation. Tanner, with his stories and patience, had taught Ellie that the value of something lies not in its perfection but in the effort put into making it meaningful. Sarah, with her contagious enthusiasm, reminded Ellie that the world was much bigger than the limits she placed on herself. Together, they weren't just friends. They had become a new kind of family that Ellie had built. The days that had once been marked by exhaustion and fear were now filled with plans and small victories. Ellie began composing her own music, something she had always been too afraid to try. Each melody carried fragments of her journey, struggle, love, despair, and hope. Her compositions began to draw the attention of local musicians who offered to collaborate. With a mix of surprise and pride, Ellie realized her music was now touching the lives of others. One evening, as she worked on a new piece, Ellie received an unexpected invitation. A prestigious music school wanted her to perform at a recital for young talent. The idea of playing for such a critical audience scared her, but she knew it was another opportunity to grow. "It's time to show the world what you've got," Sarah said, with that look that refused to take no for an answer. Preparing for the recital brought new challenges. Ellie found herself facing old insecurities, but this time, with a different perspective. It was no longer about winning or impressing others. It was about sharing her story authentically. Each practice session was a reminder of how far she had come, not just as a musician but as a person. On the day of the recital, Ellie wore a simple blue dress that Mary had helped her pick out. As she stepped onto the stage, she felt the familiar nerves, but also something new, a calm confidence that came from knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be. The piano, a flawless instrument this time, seemed to greet her as she pressed the first note. Her performance was a blend of technique and emotion, but what truly captivated the audience was the story Ellie shared before she began to play. She spoke about the broken piano, about Tanner, Sarah, Mary, and her grandmother. She told them how music had saved her family and how she believed that art could transform lives. When she finished playing, the silence in the room was followed by applause so thunderous that Ellie could barely hold back her tears. After the recital, Ellie received several offers for scholarships and performance opportunities. But more importantly, she felt a connection to something greater, the certainty that her journey, with all its ups and downs, was what made her special. She wasn't just a musician, she was a survivor, a storyteller who used notes as her words. Back at home, Ellie sat down at her old restored piano. The cracks were still there, like scars that told the story of where she had come from. But now, every touch of the keys was filled with gratitude and purpose. And so, she began to play, not for the world, but for herself, knowing that her music would never be silenced again. Ellie's house was never the same. The restored piano still stood in the center of the living room, but now it felt like a monument to resilience. Its cracks and scars were no longer flaws. They were proof of a story lived, of a battle fought and won against all odds. Every time Ellie played, the the sound filled the rooms, a reminder to everyone living there that even in the hardest times, beauty could be found. Her grandmother's health had stabilized thanks to proper treatments. Though she was no longer the strong and active woman she once was, her presence in the house became a pillar of comfort and love. She watched Ellie's performances with quiet pride, knowing her granddaughter had turned the impossible into reality. For Mary, Ellie was more than just a sister. She was a role model, a symbol of courage and determination that inspired her to dream big. Ellie continued to receive incredible opportunities, from invitations to perform at events to the chance to teach music to underprivileged children. "It's funny," she would say with a shy smile. "For so long, I thought my music was too small to change anything. Now I see it was big enough to change everything." The lessons not only helped financially but gave Ellie a new purpose, using her story to inspire others. The contract with the local businessman also opened doors for recording her compositions. Ellie began building a repertoire that reflected her journey, blending the gentle melodies of her past with the stronger notes she had learned to play through her struggles. Each piece was like a chapter of her story, and her audience began to recognize her music as something deeply authentic and moving. Her days were full, but in a different way. Ellie no longer felt the crushing weight of endless responsibilities. While she still helped care for her grandmother and remained a devoted older sister, she now found time for herself. Music, once just an escape, had become a path of growth and fulfillment. She wasn't playing to survive anymore, she was playing to live fully. At a special city event, Ellie was invited to be the headline performer. The stage was large, the lights were bright, but she felt more at ease than ever before. Before starting, she looked out at the audience and saw Tanner, Sarah, Mary, and even some of the judges from the competition. Each face was a part of her journey, a reminder that she had never truly been alone. As she played the final note of her performance, Ellie did something she never thought she'd do. She spoke. "This music isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. It's about twists and turns, about how the lies of the past can be overcome, and about how love transforms everything." The audience erupted into applause, but the greatest reward for Ellie was the warmth she felt in her heart. Back home, Ellie sat on the couch with Mary while her grandmother napped in the background. Mary, ever curious, asked, "What's your next dream, Ellie?" She smiled, glancing at the old piano and then back at her sister. "I think the next dream is helping you find yours, Mary." It was a simple answer, but one full of meaning, because Ellie knew her journey wasn't just about herself. It was about building something greater for the people she loved. In the days that followed, Ellie began working on a new project, a community music festival to bring together local artists and aspiring musicians. It was her way of giving back, creating a space where dreams could flourish regardless of circumstances. Tanner and Sarah joined the project, and the idea began to grow, bringing fresh hope to the small industrial town. Ellie's journey had started with a broken piano and a shattered soul, but it was now a complete melody. Every note, every twist, and every challenge had contributed to a story that wasn't just about survival, it was about living with purpose. And as she played in her living room, with Mary humming along beside her, Ellie knew that the true gift was the music she had discovered within herself.